Hi there, I'm Teresa from Lilly-tree, and today I'm going to show you how to make a fine Viking knit chain. I've been making a few large pieces like this one lately, so I just wanted something a bit more substantial than chain to hang them from. Now, Viking knit relies on a couple of tools. One to create the knit on, like this. This is the official version, it's called a lazy daisy, but don't panic if you haven't got it. Now, the advantage of the official tool is that it's hexagonal. It's got a couple of holes, or one large hole kind of going through diagonally, and this daisy at the end that's got 6 holes in it. Now, this is used for starting the weave, and it does make life a little bit easier. But if you haven't got the tool and don't want to invest in it until you know that you want to use Viking knit, you can make your own DIY version. Just use a pen. This one's particularly good because it is hexagonal. And then you need to create the daisy on the top. And you can do that by just taking a length of scrap wire and making 6 loops in it. So you could just bend it backwards and forwards to make the 6 loops. Then once you've got those loops, you can twist that wire together and then splay the loops out in a circle evenly around and mould it to the top of the pen. If you try to get those loops evenly spaced and coming down to the same length, that'll help the weave be even from the start. The main issue with this method is holding this in place. It may wiggle about a bit until the weave is started, but then it should be fine. And the other tool you need is a draw plate to reduce the diameter of the weave once it's finished. This is the official version, which the holes run from 5/8 of an inch down to 1/8 of an inch. But again, if you didn't want to buy one, you could create your own just by drilling some holes in some wood, which I have done just because I wanted to reduce mine down beyond the 1/8 of an inch. I'm not sure what sizes these holes are. I just lined up the DIY drill bits that I'd got and drilled holes in gradually reducing order. Then of course you need your wire to weave with. Now, the finished diameter of the chain is limited by the draw plate hole diameter, which is why I've drilled some smaller holes, the wire gauge and the number of loops woven. I personally don't like the results I've gotten from weaving less than 6 loops, so to get a fine chain I'm starting with 0.25mm diameter wire, the finest I tend to use. So let's get started. Now I'm going to start by taking a length of my wire. Normally I take a full arm span, which is about 1.5 meters, but just for demonstration purposes I've got a short length here. So I'm going to hold the end of the wire and then just thread the other end through one of those loops. Then, leaving a bit of a loop sort of hanging down, I'll thread it through the next loop. And cross over and loop it back round again. And I continue doing this all the way round, and I'm trying to keep those loops that are hanging down about even. Now, don't worry too much about this first set of loops. They will be cut off right at the end, but just keeping them reasonably even helps the rest of the weave start off quite straight and even. And once you've finished the row, you're back round to where you started. You then need to take the wire under the crossover from that first loop. Make sure the end is coming out over the spare wire and then pull that tight. So you're making a fairly straight loop going across, and then a small loop around where that wire's gone underneath. And then you can move along and take the wire under the next cross of the loops. And that is the basic weave that you just need to keep going around. Just take it under the last cross each time, and once you get back to the start, you're basically taking it around that second row that you've just made. Now my first loop is just interfering with that first proper row, so I'm just going to take my awl and just separate those back out again so I've got a space to weave through. You can choose to weave in that beginning end, so just take the wire underneath that too. It's not absolutely necessary, as it can then come out at the end, but just for neatness whilst you're working and a bit of ease getting the top off, you might want to weave it in. And then you just need to keep weaving around. I try to keep my weave as neat as possible, but it is surprising how ugly it can look before you draw it through the draw plate, and it still actually comes out fine once you've drawn the Viking knit. So don't panic too much if it's a bit untidy as you're weaving it. Now I'm just going to continue weaving this for a little bit, and then I'll come back to you and we can talk a bit more about the weave once I've got a little bit of it started. So I've now reached the end of that bit of wire, so I'll just take this last loop through with my pliers and I can show you how to add in wire. This bit of weave's a little bit shorter than it would normally be when I come to the end of the wire, just because it was that demo bit of wire, but you can see the weave's just beginning to come along. And what you'd normally need to do, because it's a little bit longer than this, is pull that top up and just make sure that your last loop is over the top of that hole. If you're working in a pen and you haven't therefore got holes in it, you can just take the wire down the side of the pen, but this hole does help a little bit. So you just pop your next bit of wire through, so it's coming out the other end of the hole, and then you can hold that there. And then you just continue the weave, taking your new bit of wire underneath the next crossover along and looping it round. Now I'm just going to make another couple of loops before I readjust my weave, something I didn't talk about earlier on, but I find it's easier when you're weaving if you've got those crossover points on the flat edges of the hexagon. It just provides enough space to get the wire through as you're weaving. They quite like to sit on the corners, and it will keep kind of popping back to that if you're not careful, but it does just make it a little bit easier. Because the hole is on the corner, once you've added in some wire, you then need to readjust it back. If when weaving you can't get your wire through, just use an awl or a pin just to slide it underneath that crossover and make space for your wire. Then once you get back round to where you've added in the wire, I want to weave in those two ends just to keep everything neat and tidy. So what you need to do is take the weave off and take that new end and keep it parallel with the old one. Just pop the top back on again, so those two wires are now lying straight down the side of the tool. Try to make sure they're parallel. And then you can just weave under the cross and under those two wires. And as I go round, I'll weave them in that way for about 5 or 6 rows, and then just chop off the excess. So you've got somewhere between 1/2 centimetre and 1 centimetre of those tails weaved in. And that really is all there is to the Viking weave. You just need to keep going till you get to the length you want, which can be quite difficult to decide how far to go, because it will lengthen as you draw it through the draw plate at the end. There is a guidance in the tool. I'll tell you some of the measurements, but for now I'm just going to keep weaving this, and I'll be back to you once it's reached the length that I want. So this is my finished Viking weave. I just wanted to give you a close-up of how the weave looks before we start drawing it through the draw plate. So just as a guide to help you, you can see my raw bit of Viking knit weave is about 31 centimetres long. I have made more than I think I need. This will either make a necklace and a bracelet, or possibly even 2 necklaces. So first thing I need to do is prepare this for drawing, and I need to take that daisy off of the top. So I'm just going to cut those loops at the top of the daisy. That daisy will then just pull out, and you'll find there's a few extra bits of wire. So if you just clean that up, you'll then find there's just one bit of wire that's the end of the rest of the weave. And then taking some scrap wire, just thread short sections through opposite loops. So you'll need 3 bits of wire in all through the 6 loops. Then just twist those together to provide something that you can pull the chain through the weave with, and it keeps the chain all nice and even as it's going through the draw plate. So now it's time to start drawing the Viking knit, and I'm going to start with the official draw plate. It should go through the 3/8 of an inch hole quite simply. Yeah, it does. That's about the size that it is anyway. So I'll take it through the next hole, which is 5/16. There's a bit of resistance there, so I know I'm on the right track. And I'm just going to take it through each hole twice, just to make sure everything's set and even. And if it's a little bit difficult getting it through the hole with just pulling with your fingers, you can then use your pliers. Now I've drawn it through the 3/16 hole. It's getting quite long, so I'll give it a quick measure. Sorry, this is off camera, but it's now measuring 56 centimetres. So we're not far off doubling the length at this stage. So I'll just continue through the rest of this draw plate. Now, after the 1/8 of an inch pull, it's 77 centimetres long, but it's still not quite as narrow a gauge as I want it, so I'm going to use my draw plate and just take it through as many holes as I want till it looks how I like it, really. So in exactly the same way as before, I'm just going to take it through the largest hole I've drilled in this bit of wood a couple of times. Now, I haven't reached the absolute limit of the narrowness of this bit of wire, but I think that's as narrow as I want to go, and that's the 5th hole. And I have given that a bit of a measure, and it's about 2¼ millimeters. And the length of my finished chain is 84 centimeters or 33 inches, which is plenty to make a couple of 16-inch necklace chains, or a necklace and a couple of bracelets even. For the pendant I showed earlier, I want a 16-inch chain, so I'm just cutting just under 16 inches off the length of this, and we need to finish the ends. And for that I'm going to use some 0.8 diameter wire. So I'm just going to cut a short length of 0.8 millimeter wire, and I want to thread this through a few millimeters from the end of the chain. It's unlikely that you can get it through just on its own, so if you take your awl, you can then make a little hole to put the wire through. So just thread that through a few centimeters, and then with your flat nose pliers bend up, and so it's running parallel to the chain itself. Then if you grip the end of the chain and that wire, you can then take the other end of the wire and wrap it around both the wire and the chain. And once you've gone round a full circle, you might just want to check it and even it up so it's a full circle, and then continue wrapping around. I want to wrap this about 5 times in all, but you could make a shorter coil if you wanted to. And you might find once you've started that it's easier then to hold the coil in the pliers and then take the other end around. Once you're happy with the coil, cut off the excess 0.8 millimeter wire and any little bits of the chain wire that might still be sticking out of the end. Do be careful with this because they will catch and irritate if you leave them there. I'm just going to close that end up a bit and then bend over that last bit of wire, cut off the excess, and then with my round nose pliers I can make a small loop. A little bit too much wire there, so just chop off a little bit more and complete my loop. There are many other ways you could finish off a Viking chain, but I quite like the neatness of this one. Do exactly the same on the other end, and then I'm ready to put the clasp on. I've got a trigger clasp, so I'm going to add that onto one end with a small jump ring. And then a larger jump ring on the other end for the clasp to fit into. So then I'm going to patina the whole chain, and once that's done, it's ready for the pendant.